And we are live. All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the very last public talk in our series, Screening, Human Nature in Crisis. The series is part of 421's Curatorial Development Exhibition Program, which is in partnership with Bombay Institute for Critical Analysis and Research, BICAR. In this series, we've been exploring ideas of artistic practice and the Anthropocene, the environmental crisis, and drawing knowledge from land, as well as the critical role of creating amongst all this mayhem that we're living through. Today, we're very, very excited to hear from Frank Ruda, who we've had the pleasure of having in our previous conversations, as well as our closed session. And Frank is a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Dundee, Scotland, as well as a professor for philosophy at the European Graduate School. In one of our earlier conversations, I've went through the illustrious list of publications that Frank had undertaken and looks to publish in the future as well. So I will save us this, but please find his full information in the description of this video, on our website, all these other platforms. Today's talk will be moderated by Rohit. Rohit Goel is the director and founder of BICAR. And so you've probably seen him in some of the other videos in this series. If not, I encourage you to take a look at the playlist. Lots of incredible conversations have been taking place. And as well as, of course, our previous collaborations and series of talks, Future Perfect. And hopefully more exciting series of talks together. But without much more blabbing on my side, Rohit, I don't know if you want to say a few words, otherwise the floor would be Frank's.
Yeah, off to Frank. I'm eagerly anticipating this, and Frank has been I'll just say that he's been a wonderful collaborator with both Mace, myself, Warehouse, BICAR, and really thank you for that, Frank. And we're really happy to have you, I think
co-conspiring.
Yes, co-conspire and cap off our colloquium series. So thank you so much, and especially during the holiday season. So thank you.
Well, thank you both. It's actually my pleasure. What I'm about to present, I finished about 10 minutes ago. So it is the first rehearsal, so to speak. So let's see how that goes. I'm starting with two quotations. The first is from Pierre Hadot, and it runs like as follows: "The great secret of nature is nature herself." And the second one is from Goethe: "We are terrified by the silent gravity of nature and by her silence." First part: to afford or not to afford, this is the question. The nature of the contemporary situation is confused and confusing. The reasons for this are multiple and thus themselves disorienting. Firstly, one can undoubtedly register an increase in and of urgency, at least in the rhetoric that concerns our relation to nature. Nature seems to be in disarray. We are the cause of this disarray, and we must act fast. This is why, as we all know, we hear repeated calls to action everywhere and all the time. Even if they often seem to remain unanswered or might be in themselves unanswerable, these calls are all emphasizing how urgent it is that we act now and do not postpone whatever we will attempt to prevent the catastrophe. And this seems to be the one thing everyone is certain about. There is an impending catastrophe looming over us. The urgent calls are thus calls to act such that we change our situation. We have to change something now. If we do not act, we are doomed to lose all control soon or in the very nearby future. We have to act now. We are reminded constantly, otherwise we're ultimately doomed to disappear as agents producing their own destiny. Now is the time to act, but not to think or reflect. Otherwise, there will be neither time to think nor to act anymore. So what makes the contemporary situation even worse is that even though now some time to think and reflect would be urgently needed, but this urgency is an urgency of a different kind. If we were to wait and think now, we can be certain it will be too late if it is not already too late anyhow. Or our present is now, and if we do not rise to the occasion, rise to this particular now, so to speak, we will have lost the one opportunity to still have a future. But what is the now of times in which we grasp what we urgently need to do now? These are problems obviously reminiscent of Hegel's discussion of sense certainty, notably that the moment I say now, now is not now anymore. One possible answer one might be tempted to give is that the present urgency to act, and as such, it is often presented, results directly from an increase in our knowledge of facts. We know more, and the surplus of knowledge creates a surplus of urgency. And even though the increase in knowledge undoubtedly plays a crucial role for our present predicament, the call to urgent action is often articulated in such a way that it's not entirely clear what the urgent action is actually supposed to be. Often it is articulated, therefore, in the negative. We urgently need to stop. We need to stop global warming, for example, and certainly we must, urgently. We urgently need to stop burning fossil fuels. We need to stop fracking. We need to stop the dying out of species. We urgently need to stop doing the things that are wrong to do in the first place. What this means is that we urgently, what urgently has to be done is strangely identical with what we urgently should not do, what we ought not to do anymore. The urgency of the action thereby seems to derive from the assumption that we have to stop doing what we're doing because what we have been doing is wrong. Firstly, therefore, the confused and confusing nature of the contemporary situation derives from the fact that there is an urgent call to act, which frequently does not come with any clear affirmative or positive content. Rather, what we're told is that we must stop doing what we're collectively doing, eat meat, pollute the environment, etc. The urgency to act thereby is linked in not entirely transparent ways to the urgency to stop acting the way we're acting now. But we have been wronging the animals, nature, the earth, and the urgency we are now confronted with is an urgency to stop wronging either of these. The urgency to act is an urgency to stop acting the way we do. The claim to urgency, secondly, results from the fact that we are, as we are repeatedly reminded, running out of time. The urgency to act, which is supposed to incentivize us to stop acting the way we do, is linked to the idea that if we do not follow the call to act, more precisely to stop acting, we will not have enough time anymore to act at all. We are running out of time because if we do not act now, the contemporary situation will be transformed into a situation where we will no longer have any agency anymore. The claim that there is an urgent need to act and urgently stop acting the way we acted thus far thereby presumes that the contemporary situation is one in which we still have agency and in which we're still able to act. So it's sort of good news. We are told we have to act because we still have agency, but we might lose it soon. The urgency to act now thus derives from the possibility of acting and from the possibility of losing the possibility to act. These are both implied assumptions. We can act, we can lose the capacity to act, so we have to stop acting the way we act, because otherwise our action will lead us into inaction, and thus only stopping our collective actions will allow us to maintain a chance to preserve the capacity to act at all. And this is still possible in the present conjuncture. It is now still possible to prevent the negation of the possibility to act, and this is what urgently has to happen. The only way in which this can happen, at least in part, is by stopping to acting, or by stopping acting in a certain way that still predominates. One must stop acting to be able to maintain the possibility of future action. This is the matter of urgency. Thirdly, the whole conundrum is derived from what I want to call, with reference to a certain phenomenological tradition, a situational affordance. We are thus in the strange situation where we are lucky that there still is a situational affordance which we can meet with an agential reaction that stops us acting the way we do. The real imagined nightmare consists in producing a situation in which there is situational affordance without the possibility of any agential potential. This is what is conceived of as being synonymous with the ultimate catastrophe. The contemporary situation is bad because it affords us to act such that we change how we act, notably stop acting the way we act now. But the situation is not as bad as it could be because we're still the supposed subjects of this urgent affordance. A sujet supposé d'adresser, and thus a sujet supposé de l'exister comme sujet. At least this is what the contemporary rhetoric imagines and projects onto the situation, or more precisely, onto what is taken to be a situational affordance. The requirement and exigency of the situation, its situational affordance, is addressed to a subject, which can still be addressed in terms of a subject, even though the subject might have to learn that it's no longer the sovereign and authoritative subject. But it is the subject that has to learn that it's no longer the subject. This is an urgent exigency. What is a situational affordance then? An affordance of a situation is, and I'm again referring here to the phenomenological tradition, think of someone like Hubert L. Dreyfus, for example, something that describes the experience of a subject engaged with and immersed in a situation where this subject is an agent determined by the situation in such a way that she reacts to it appropriately. A situational affordance is thus the way in which the situation determines the reaction of an immersed subject by reacting to what a situational affordance affords, and the subject does so without thinking. The phenomenologists like sports as examples to elucidate this point. Think of someone playing professional baseball. The situational affordance can be that she has to drop her bat and start running immediately. If there are situational affordances in our contemporary situation, we must drop everything and stop what we're doing right now, as it produces a situation in which we will no longer be able to drop and stop anything anymore. At least this is what we imagine the affordance to ultimately be. But it is still us who has to do it. Fourthly, the contemporary situation is thus confused and confusing because there seems to be a situational affordance, and it's also clear what ought to be our reaction to it. But we are simply not doing what the situation affords. There's a surprising difference that one can detect between the contemporary situation of the so-diagnosed impending climate catastrophe and what it seems to demand from us, and the situation of the pandemic and what it afforded from us. The pandemic situation seemed to have required certain reactions, and almost everywhere, and in an unseen effort, a huge part of the, at least Western hemisphere of the planet, stopped doing what it was doing beforehand. But why does the same not happen in the contemporary situation with regard to what we perceive as what nature seems to demand from us? I refer here to the pandemic situation because both situation, the pandemic and the climate crisis situation, seem to come with similar affordances, and both are at the same time overdetermined by capital interests that are overpowering all governmental decision-making processes, yet the reactions are fundamentally different. Why is the reaction to the affordance so different? This is a question that once also Andreas Malm raised in his book on Corona. This question is a symptom of the confused and confusing nature of the contemporary situation, and certainly part of an answer lies in the fact that the pandemic was from its very inception nothing but a temporary interruption and not a permanent one, even though different new ways were always possible, but it was clear and anticipated it will not go on forever. And I'm here also ignoring many of the intricacies that lie in comparing these two events, if both are events in whatever qualification, one of which seems to be more like a sudden shock, the other has a distinctively different character and different temporality. But both seem to afford from us in different ways, or our interpretation of the affordance works differently. So what is an affordance? How does one identify it? Since it might be unclear what they are, right? This is why it's a question, since it might be unclear what they are. If we react according to the affordance of a situation in which we are and act as agents, our action is determined by the nature of the situation and by the determination of what the affordance demands. But is it always clear what makes an affordance into an affordance? Simply put, what if the affordance is not easy to objectively be identified and hence relies to a certain degree on an interpretation? Maybe the situation is even worse. What if there is no affordance without an interpretation, or more precisely put, what if the interpretation is not interpreting something that objectively exists before the interpretation, but is rather a form of practice that constitutes what it interprets in the act of interpreting? To make this more concrete, is the present affordance to not let the global temperature exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, or can it be 2 max? Is there wiggle room from for another half degree maybe? But maybe this is then just a matter of nuance. But what if Elon Musk is right all along? And let me just be clear, he is not. To think about human settlements on other planets all along. Should we maybe just stop what we're doing when we're trying to stop what we're doing and invest all we can in new technologies that will solve the problem and allow us to appropriately react to what this situation actually affords from us? Now, here we have come full circle. Precisely what is the affordance of the contemporary situation in our relation to nature? I'm not suggesting that the phenomenological tradition here seems to help only minimally. Rather, I'm suggesting that the present confusion about what to do is directly linked to how to contour the contemporary situation and the affordance and exigencies it comes with. What do we hear when we fantasize about the scream of nature? What is the screen telling us? The phenomenological tradition in philosophy endorsed the claim excuse me, that when we act by only responding to affordances, we act the best we can. To refer again to the aforementioned example, a professional baseball player acts the best she can if she acts by responding successfully to affordances of the situation she is in. That they do not think but act according to situational demands, and often to affordances that are otherwise invisible to anyone who is not a professional player of this very sport, is what makes professional sportsmen or women into professionals. When everything works out, the phenomenologists claim we are fully immersed in the situation. So that I'm citing Lee Braver here, neither we nor world, but just smoothly flowing activity, unquote. We go with the affordance flow. What might seem to be an immense increase in performance skills, say of the professional baseball player, thereby coincides with a downgrading on another level. We act the best when we do not think. Hubert Dreyfus has elucidated this bidirectional dynamic by recurse to another example, that if a professional chess player playing lightning chess, so a form of chess where they only have minimal time to react to the situation on the chessboard and almost no time to think if they want to be successful. And here, Dreyfus' example, I quote, when the grandmaster is playing lightning chess, as far as he can tell, he is simply responding to patterns on the board. At this speed, he must depend entirely on perception and not at all on analysis and comparison or alternatives. There is an urgent need to respond, not thinking the grandmaster plays best, fully immersed in the situation, but this is not only how very skilled performers act, but for the phenomenologist, I quote again, in their direct dealing with affordances, adults, infants, and animals respond alike, unquote. We might thus here pause for a moment and ask the obvious question. Why does the same not happen in the contemporary situation? What does prevent us from stopping the diagnosed damage that we do to nature and that it seems to screamingly tell us about everywhere? If we ask the phenomenologist such a question, she might give a surprising answer, because in her account, there are two kinds of hindrances to the sort of immersed, embedded affordance response flow. One is subjective and the other is objective. The objective one emerges when the ways in which we're usually reacting to situational affordances are exhausted and do not work anymore. Then we encounter a problem. A problem stops the immersed flow of affordance reaction. If we encounter an affordance for which we have no proper ways of responding, we have to think, step back, and reflect. This is the phenomenologist's account how evolutionarily, for example, human beings even came about in the first place. Something stopped the previous practice of pervasive, mindless, absorbed coping. That was a quote. There was a problem that emerged in the coping practices of higher apes, a problem that hindered them to continue how they did before, to act how they acted before. This is what forced them to stand back and develop the capacity to think and reflect. Note, this is a very different argument from the one you can find in Friedrich Engels' account, who in his famous text on the part played by labor and the transition from ape to man, claims that the material bodily constitution of human beings emerged rather through a form of practical parapraxis. The apes wanted to free their hands to climb and access better fruits, and this led them to work for their own reproduction and made them stand up, which generate the material conditions for an emergence of man many years later. But back to the phenomenologist. When there emerges a problem and an immersed coping practice is hindered, thinking and reflection is needed. A problem, therefore, could therefore be understood either as an affordance of a new kind or as an affordance whose contours are themselves unclear. Maybe we could go as far as presuming that there could be affordances that become problems because we do not know intuitively what they demand as reaction, if any at all. Against this background, we could venture to suspect that the urgency emphasis of the contemporary situation puts us in a confusing situation. There is an affordance, we might not know how to respond to it, but the one thing that we're told not to do is to step back and think and reflect. It is confusing, as what it seems to demand is the opposite of what is structurally needed. And this is where one can bring in the other type of hindrance of the affordance coping flow, the subjective one. It emerges, according to the phenomenologist's account, when an agent starts overthinking her habituated ways of immersed coping. There again are a number of sports examples the phenomenologists like to refer to. One is linked to the end of the career of the baseball player Chuck Knobloch, who, after he started reflecting on his moves in the game, not only started performing worse, but rather he even started to unlearn to play in any professional way whatsoever. He started reflecting on his technique and never got out of it again, overthinking his every move. This phenomenon is also referred to as Steve Sachs syndrome, or more generally as the yips. When an agent overthinks his immersed coping with situational affordances, we step out, as it were, of this practice and overthink our responses. Thereby, we hinder ourselves from responding to any situational affordances in an adequate way. In such a situation, I quote Hubert Dreyfus, behavior regresses to mere competence, unquote, since, quote again, paying attention to the solicitation as I act on it can at best lead to competence. At best, I am competent in reacting when I overthink, unquote. Mindless immersed acting is always more practically efficient than pondering what to do and overthinking practice. That's the phenomenologist assumption. There's a practice-blocking vicious circle of reflection. Overthinking leads to underperformance. The contemporary situation in which we are addressed as subjects that should react to specific affordances mobilizes these two types of coping and response blockages, and it thereby confronts us with a rather topsy-turvy combination of an objective and subjective hindrance to our agency. It confronts us with an affordance for which we do not have an already existing response strategy, and it would be thus, according to the phenomenologist, high time to reflect. But this is precisely what we're not supposed to do, as it is otherwise too late. And we will lose all agency that we have strangely already lost if we do not stand back and reflect. Excuse me. And at the same time, if we step out of this dilemma by overthinking it, if we end over discussing it, over theorizing it without actually acting on it at all, while not even stopping to act the way we're acting right now, it is like we're overthinking thinking, as if we're overthinking what it means to reflect on a problem. By reflecting too much on how to approach the problem in the first place, we get something like the thinking yips, a type of yips of thought that incapacitates, presumably the only mode in which we could have the slightest chance to solve the dilemmas and disorientations involved. We strangely overact, this is the objective side, and do not think enough, and we strangely overthink, which blocks thinking and the exercise of it at the same time. This leads us to underthink and underact. The thinking yips makes us unable to conceive of new ways of acting collectively and what a valid action would be at all. Recently, there was an activist group, just anecdotally in Germany, called the Last Generation, that came to some prominence because they started blocking airports and streets and started to attack cultural objects like paintings and so forth. And strangely, the reaction, maybe not so strangely, but the reaction of German politicians, many German politicians, was to compare them, to address them as green terrorists, compare them to the green Red Army fraction. The absolutely interesting aspect of this, if one looks at what this group actually demands, it's not radical at all. They just don't want to die, and are desperate and think the government doesn't. So they don't have a strong political program in any way. They just think the government betrays them, and they want their voice heard. Anyhow, I just think this is a symptom of what I'm trying to describe. Overacting and thinking and collective thinking and acting gifts comes together, all of the worst options at once. A symptom of the strange conjuncture of the thinking gifts and for the coincidence of over and underacting manifests in the peculiar ambiguities and indeterminacies, the many projections and fantasies that are involved in the very language in which we face the problem, especially when we refer to it as a form of nature in disarray or screaming. Since what is it that nature demands, affords to us, solicitates from us, or solicitates us to do, if anything at all? The problem, as I suggested, might rather lie in identifying the affordances, if there are any, in the right way. And this again depends on what we believe to hear when we think we hear, and how that and how nature screams. And as we will see subsequently, the assumption that nature screams, even though we do not know what it affords from us or if it demands anything at all, is one that is shared by many. Without any doubt, this has a bearing with what we project onto ourselves, with what we take our own place to be in all of this. Are we the ultimate culprits? First and last subjects, those who have been all powerful. This is the lesson of the Anthropocene, who are at the same time absolutely powerless. This is the other lesson of the Anthropocene. Is it even adequate to conceive of the present conjuncture in terms of exigencies and affordances anymore? In other words, if it is possible for us to step out of the situation and overthink it, is it possible because we're not always in it? We were not always in it. So not always simply in nature, not simply always an inhabitant of Earth, for example. Or is this assumption exactly part of the problem? Or because both is the same and is the case, or is both the case at the same time? All this indicates that the nature of the contemporary situation is confused and confusing, so confused that its basic coordinates are unclear, and so confusing because it's often highly disorienting what we even mean when we speak about nature. In the following, I will very briefly trace, and that's not true, I will just trace, and not very briefly, 3 problematic forms of problematizing our contemporary situation that, to my mind, are symptoms of the present disorientation, and will then seek to very briefly and more clearly determine how we should avoid identifying contemporary exigencies. Second part, knowing what to do and not doing it. The 3 positions I will critically discuss are John Holloway's, Isabel Stenger's, and Bruno Latour's. In each case, I will massively extrapolate, abbreviate, and condense, but for the sake of forcing some clarity into disorientation. I will then move on to articulating some consequences by drawing very briefly on the work of Alain Badiou, and a bit more extensively on that of Karl Marx. So let me begin again. Earlier this year, in 2022, Travis Holloway published a book which addresses the status and function of theory, art, and politics in the Anthropocene. This book is called How to Live at the End of the World, and it opens by stating, I quote, "Our planet has entered into an era of instability for the first time in about 11,500 years." Unquote. Our planetary present is a present of novel planetary instability. This instability is a historical product of our engagement with the planet we inhabit, and Holloway aims to analyze how this de- and instabilization marks what one could classify as a species event, that is, an event that concerns every member of the human species. This is at least how Holloway appears to read what is named with the term Anthropocene. Its specificity derives from the fact that it is the first event in human history that concerns every single member of the human species. I quote, "The Anthropocene puts an end to the fantasy of sheer individualism, worldlessness, and human exceptionalism once and for all," unquote. His argument can at first glance seem compatible with an argument made by Maurice Blanchot a while back, notably that only because of the emergence of a universal threat of extinction, there emerges for the first time the possibility of a truly universal perspective for and of the human species. The argumentative twist of this logic is that the human species as a collective agent can only be conceived of from the moment when it faces the threat of disappearance, and it thus emerges, in other words, out of a potentially unintended act and as potentially unintended consequence of practices that lead to its own self-annihilation. Or in other words, human beings have no positive feature in common that would bind them together, but they can be brought together ex negatively through the threat of their own annihilation. A phoenix emerges from ashes that are not even its own. Today, the threat of annihilation results from the impending climate catastrophe, which will destroy the conditions that allow us to inhabit this planet. This is what, in my slightly forced reading, for Holloway results from the indicated destabilization of our planet and of nature. It is not a direct self-annihilation. That's the difference to Blanchot, who was formulating his argument vis-a-vis the threats or the invention of the atomic bomb, but an indirect one that does not directly concern the production of annihilation as a result of our action, but rather one where our actions generate the impossibility of maintaining the reproduction of the species. It's an indirect annihilation brought about by destroying the material conditions of reproduction of the species. In Holloway's words, just when another world no longer seemed possible, it became inevitable. Unquote. The question is then, what do we take the planet to be such that it's possible that a destabilization can happen that undermines the very conditions for the continuous reproduction of the human species? The short answer is the planet is what we inhabit, where we and from which we live. But we do not negate the planet or its atmosphere or nature as such if we endanger our conditions of reproduction. The planet will continue to exist, as will nature after our demise, right? I mean, that's pretty obvious. This is why, and in the sense of the Anthropocene as species event, if we delineate the problem like Holloway does, we take nature or the planet to be what Frederick Jameson famously described as a vanishing mediator. The function of the vanishing mediator is, in the words of Etienne Balibar now, that of a, quote, transitory institution that rearranges the elements inherited from the very institution that has to be overcome, unquote. If nature or the planet is what allows to potentially raise consciousness to the level of species self-consciousness, what allows the species to appear as subject, then it is a vanishing mediator. It only appears to make appear a subject that was always already latently there, but only comes into being by negating its latency, even its potential existence. This new subject arises from the threat, not of its own extinction, but through the threat of the extinction of the very material conditions of reproduction, of its possibility or latency, and hence of its status avenir. But now we know the threat is here and there should be no longer anything to come. This is one of the things we have to stop. Let me put it like this: the to come has to go. We should emerge all together as a species subject, and we should act together. And the one thing to stop when everything is deemed to end at the end of the world is the assumption that there's anything else to come. The event has happened, we know it, and thus we have to act upon our knowledge. The species event is a knowledge event. Give me 1 second. My apologies. Sorry, stupid flu. But why then? This is then the immediate but also far-reaching question: does this not lead human beings to act as a species? So if that is what comes into being as knowledge, why don't we act upon that very knowledge? That this transition, we know what to do and we do what we know we have to do, does not always go so smoothly and might allow for some regrouping of its own, becomes intelligible when one reminds oneself of the endeavors of Branson, Musk, and Bezos in 2021, when they initiated travels to space and made it clear that it was no longer a small step for a man and a giant leap for mankind, but rather a giant leap for mankind and a small step for one man to conceive of what it means to leave our planet. In 2021, what was supposed to be a form of negative universal reversalism, reversed universalism from universal threat to universal subject, was again reversed. It became privatized. It's just individualism, worthlessness, and human exceptionalism for the few and not for the many or for all. Exactly what seems unthinkable for Holloway. Human exceptionalism now has become a privilege. But how can it be that what cannot but be perceived and is known as species threat does not lead to the species taking unified collective actions, but rather leads to further segregation and splitting and privatization within? Why does this universally available knowledge not become efficient or practically effective? Is it because we did not make the knowledge known enough? This seems hardly convincing. How does one understand such a defense mechanism against the conversion from universal threat to universal subject? Why does universal knowledge not translate into universal practice? Whatever logic might be endangered of continuing and might make us forced to consider its internal consistency, it is certainly not that of capital. For Holloway, this cannot but be a failed response to the affordance of the situation. So it seems we can misidentify affordances, and he believes that we know and that knowledge is enough if properly mediated. That's the point. It must be properly mediated. Which is why he calls for what he calls a new kind of aesthetics. As a means of mediation, we need a new captivating narrative that translates what we know into a motivating narrative that allows us to act so that we actively respond to the situational affordances For this, we need new grand narratives after the end of grand narratives, a narrative which does not only have us as protagonists, but also, I quote, non-humans, oceans, and stone, unquote. If we collect, quote again, shared stories of the catastrophe due to climate change, since this new epic is necessarily derived, necessarily differentiated and local, unquote, this will help reinventing the epic tale, which will enable us to see how our task is a heroic one, since it is one in which the human beings also have to give up their primacy and accept that a new, I quote, a different kind of people, unquote, has to be accounted for. What is this new epic heroism about? It is about assuming the consequences that, I quote again, humans do not live in concord with the rest of the earth anymore, unquote. So let us return to that perturbed harmony. Let us accept being a part of the rest of the earth. We know we have to, we know that we can, we just need to understand that we have to stop resisting doing it and put it into actual practice. We have to overcome the hesitation and find the right collective species motivation to act as species agents. And this is what art can make us do. Next part, not knowing what to do as belief system. Isabel Stengers is less optimistic in her pessimism than one can read in her 2015 book, In Catastrophic Times, Resisting Becoming Barbarism. She shares Holloway's diagnosis, if I may speak anachronistically, but she also claims, I quote, that we're more badly equipped than ever for putting to work the solutions defined as necessary, unquote. We know what we have to urgently do since, I quote again, the window of opportunity in which on paper the measures to take were reasonably clear is in the process of closing, unquote. So we know what we have to do, but we just do not know how to do it. Now the situation is one, so to speak, in which the affordance is clear, but our reaction is not, and this might simply be the case because there's no appropriate reaction, no way to appropriately cope with what is afforded from us. There is a collective paralysis that springs from the experience of, I quote again, the disproportionate gap between what we are capable of and what is needed, unquote. The reason for this is because our action can no longer simply be that of a universal agent, which avoids a catastrophe from happening. Rather, the catastrophe has somehow already begun, and in part this leads to a fundamental transformation of what the role of nature is. For her, for Stengers, nature now becomes, I quote, a power to question us all, unquote. And the confused nature of the situation does not only pertain to the concept of nature, but to all other concepts we use to conceive of us as agents in our own place. I quote again, the order words are clear, Stengers writes, but the points of view on the link between these order words that mobilize and the solutions to the problems that are accumulating, growing social inequality, pollution, poisoning the pesticides, by pesticides, exhaustion of raw materials, groundwater depletion, etc., couldn't be more confused, unquote. The reason for this is that today, nature is nothing that needs to be protected anymore from damage caused by us humans to it, but rather has become something that fundamentally threatens, I quote, our modes of thinking and of living for good, unquote. As long as we could still believe that the whole nature of the situation puts us in the driver's seat and therefore nature into a subservient position, the climate crisis was never a real crisis. We, say a species subject, could have simply protected it from damage. But nature is out of joint. It's no longer the nature that needs our protection, that we would even know how to protect, but it's a nature that changes its character. The world is no longer one that welcomes, so to speak, like Heidegger, our project, but it is itself so out of joint that it might prove to be ultimately not a friendly place anymore. Nature turned into what Lacanians call a thing, de-natura, rerum. Nature became denatured, unnatured. But because of this, we might describe it for now either as an ontological transformation of nature or as a revelation of another dimension of what we otherwise did not see because of what we projected nature to be, notably a welcoming system of harmony and order. Even the concepts in which we conceive of historical transformation need to be put into question. Concepts like progress or growth, for example, but also fundamentally the very idea of representative politics. Stengers' point is that governments, or what she calls our guardians, have proven impotent to deal with the problems that threaten the very existence of us all. This, I quote, sentiment of impotence, unquote, manifests in a contradiction, notably that we're at the same time told to keep consuming, but also to mind our carbon footprint. The impotence of the present forms of representative politics manifests in a twofold expression for Stengers, namely in sheer panic on the one hand side and in the hope that some form of, I quote, miracle might save us, a miracle of technology or whatever nature. So the times are catastrophic. What to do with this? Stengers, here reminiscent again of the Blanchot argument I mentioned earlier, claims, I quote, it is up to us to create a manner of responding for ourselves, but also for the innumerable living species that we're dragging into the catastrophe, and despite this us only existing virtually as summoned by the response to the given, by the response to be given, unquote. We are creating the subject that responds to the situational affordance by responding to the affordance. It is a subject that does not precede its act, but is brought into existence by it, and thereby it must be, whatever precisely this means, more than human, a multi-species subject. But how does this purely virtual we or us do this? How do we respond to an affordance that we fail to find the right response to beforehand? Stengers' claim is that we can respond if we name the affordance, name this transformed nature appropriately. And the name is providing a cause for motivation for action. Because, I quote, to name is not to say what is true, but to confer on what is named the power to make us feel and think in the mode of what that the name calls for. To make us feel and think in the mode that the name calls for, unquote. Let me elucidate this. If we give nature the right name, for example, we will, in our effective and conceptual approach to it, act and think differently. What could such a name be? You may all already know this. This name is Gaia. This is what she takes up, as others have before her, from James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. We have to use, who used it in the 70s. We have to use nature as a screen and project but the right thing onto it. We know it is just a projection, just a name. But here, mobilizing all the powers of fetishistic disavowal, it works nevertheless. If we name nature Gaia, we give nature the name of one of the ancestral mothers of all life, the sky, Uranus, and the sea, Pontus, and the personification of the earth. What is at stake in the naming operation is thus, we think differently of nature and act differently in relation to it if we conceive of it and relate to it as if it was a deity, a divine other, an ancestral other. This avoids, I quote, the temptation to reduce, unquote, what nature affords from us, quote again, to a simple problem, unquote. Obviously, the price to pay for this avoidance of reduction is a theologization of nature, turning her not only into an other, but into a goddess. Stenger's strategy is to understand Gaia as, I quote, the one who intrudes, unquote, and as a goddess that is blind to the damage she causes. She bears therefore certain similarities to the Protestant God, the abyssal God of Luther, the utter manifestation of what Freud would have described as super-ego. That demands, while knowing we will never be able to respond appropriately. A God who is fundamentally indifferent to us and with regard to whom we can only understand how impotent and incapable we are, and with whom we share no common measure. It is an other who demands we are at the same time unable to ever properly fulfill. Nature as Gaia is a mother, but a snappy one. A mother that does not easily forgive. A mother, writes Stengers, perhaps but an irritable one, who should not be offended. That's her slogan, a mother who should not be offended, unquote. For if she is offended, she is, quote again, indifferent to the question who is responsible and doesn't act as righter of wrong, unquote. She even, like the Protestant God, punishes those who have tried to be virtuous. In our case, this will be immediately and at first, I quote Stengers again, the poorest of the planet and those living beings that have nothing to do with the affair, unquote. Lovelock, as you may know, followed from this the ethic of non-offense of nature as divine, other or mother, that we will have to reduce the human population on the earth to about 500 million in order to pacify Gaia. Stengers seems to be more conceptually radical than this obviously rather problematic and in many respects conservative approach, and insist that Gaia does not demand anything. She will just punish if offended. There is no demand, right? There's nothing we could actually do in response. So there is no normative measure that would allow us to know what to do. We only have to find collective ways of how not to offend her. In an ethics of non-offense that seeks to avoid the intrusion of Gaia, that seeks avoiding to provoke her. An ethics of non-offense which we can learn, and this is a crucial reference, from indigenous people who have a form of practical but non-propositional knowledge, non-propositional form of knowledge that is based on respecting or non-offending Gaia as the one who is easily provoked and then intrudes. It's an ethics that is less based on knowledge and technology, not based on science or our action, but on the insight that we're dependent on and will never be able to respond appropriately to what results from us offending Gaia, simply because it explodes the very idea that her reaction to be offended could, or to offense, could ever be understood in terms of affordance or demand. With the move from Holloway to Stengers, we move from a form of optimistic pessimism that believes in a new epic, might we want to say a new multi-species Bible, that will allow us to understand our relation to nature appropriately and allows us to act accordingly to what is afforded and demanded from us. So we move from what I am tempted to call an aestheticized Catholicism to a new Protestant ethic, maybe one with a Levinasian twist. And yes, my argument is that both positions are deeply theological and religious. The first, unwillingly, it seems to me, the second mobilizes a religious trope that we know just to be a fictitious trope, and we nevertheless believe in it as it allows us to act more responsibly than otherwise. I very briefly want to add a third eco-religious position to this gathering. Next part, solving nature contradiction in a past future. In 2022, again, Nikolai Schulz and Bruno Latour published a brief book, just came out a week ago in English, a memorandum called, quote, On the Emergence of an Ecological Class, unquote, and they raise at its beginning the question, I quote, under what conditions can ecology organize politics around itself instead of being just one movement among others, unquote. So here it is straightforwardly clear. Ecology is supposed to become the determining factor, not in politics, but determining politics, such that politics is organized under the primacy of ecology. It is almost a substitute, right? I mean, it's a substitution of hierarchy. This is what they call political ecology. It's an ecology that determines politics and not the other way around. What does ecology here refer to? It refers to our relationship to nature, but nature is no longer, and this is what makes ecology political, unifying. Nature, as I write, divides, unquote. This also means that if the very signifier nature suggests a unit that is no longer existent, ecology is not unified but diverse, must be diverse, and it must, so to speak, be everywhere, because everything locally is sort of specific and different. Ecology becomes a new form of universalism, one could say. It's everywhere, but one without universality, where no universal solution is or form would be valid. It's fragmented. It's relying on diversity, fragmentation, and division. But here enters the problem for Latour and Schulz, since if ecology concerns almost everything, from coal to plastic, from plants to humans, from oceans to skies, a peculiar contradiction emerges. On the one hand side, all the topics can generate much effective responses. On the other, they often leave people indifferent. What to do with this? The authors claim one line of demarcation can still be drawn, notably that between friends and enemies. There is a maybe closet Schmittianism one might be able to detect here. There's a general state of war, that's their term in ecology, or what they later in the book call a new class struggle, unquote. And this is what truly makes ecology into political ecology. And Latour and Schulz therefore believe that the best way of articulating how one organizes oneself in this conflict is by mobilizing and transforming the traditional concept of the class. So class. Why? Because it always was descriptive on the one hand side, right? So we described the working class in a certain way, but also performative. Performative that only through the description a class was brought into being. Jacques Rancière has written a text about, intended to be critical, but I think the argument is compatible with Latour's, that the Communist Manifesto wrote the proletariat into existence. So the concept of class was always descriptive, but also performative and allowed to generate new perspectives and thus new possibilities for action. But today, the class concept has to be reformulated, Latour and Schulz believe, because the material conditions of what a class can be taken to be have changed, because our understanding of materiality and nature, as indicated, has also changed. Previously, and for the entire 20th century, the class concept was linked to the concept of production. One belonged to a certain class dependent on one's position in the production process. Today, this can no longer be the case, since what matters most, this is my reformulation of their argument, is not production, but the conditions of possibility of reproduction. In their terminology, the new class struggle is about, I quote, the maintenance of the conditions of inhabitability on the planet, unquote. The new class struggle is thus formally determined, right? The form of the class struggle is absolutely clear. It is a class struggle about one thing. And the one thing is inhabitability. Right? One class is against this maintenance and thereby an enemy, not of the people, but of habitability of all species. The other seeks to defend the conditions of possibility of reproduction. Class analysis in this new class struggle then means to analyze the relation between human beings and what they depend on, which is more than just means of production, but the means of reproduction that fundamentally are means of inhabitability. For this reason, the class Latour and Schulz try to write into existence, the ecological class, in their coinage, has a clear goal, notably to decrease its position in the relations its position in the conditions of production. This is the difference in their view to a Marxist point of view, right? So the Marxists want to strengthen the classes, the working classes, for example, position in the vis-a-vis the relations of production, and the ecological class does exactly the opposite. The politics of this class then is thus one which is immediately planetary and thereby, as they believe, overcomes political distinction into nation states and traditional conceptions of sovereignty. Thereby, its enemies are at the same time, must be at the same time, all those who don't think in planetary dimensions, so the nationalists, so to speak, but at the same time, also those who think in problematic planetary dimensions, all proponents of a productive form of globalization or globalization depending on production, and hence classical socialists or liberalists. What this means is a redetermination of all classical political emancipatory language for them. Everything needs to be rethought from the perspective of maintaining the means of inhabitability. This, for example, generates a different concept of freedom, since if freedom is linked to maintaining the conditions of possibility of reproduction, then it means that the freedom of the ecological class depends on conditions, on material conditions and other species. So it's freedom and dependence fall into one another. Here, Latour and Schulz argue, we encounter what they call attachments that liberate us. And this means, I quote again, the more we are dependent, the better, unquote. The implication of this lies again in the fact that nature is nothing we have to protect. Nature is not a victim of our action, but rather, I quote, we are nature that defends itself, unquote, as they have it with the French statists, or, I quote again, that's their formulation, living beings, we are living beings among other living beings in an open development, unquote. All this might sound promising, nice, convincing even, but here Latour and Schulz encounter the real problem. The class they are referring to, the ecological class, does not seem to exist as political agent or entity. So my computer is doing weird stuff. It is rather existing as, so the class is not existing as political agent or entity, it's rather as divided as nature is. We might say that the natura naturans and the natura naturata have the identical structure, division and diversity to the degree of disorganization, or worse, in existence. What could bring it into existence as a unified agent? That is the question they're occupied with, right? I mean, so the answer is we write it into existence, it's not enough. Thus far, political ecology, as the authors admit, has only generated panic and relied, and that was the only, relied on a negative affect, and what they call, with an implicit reference to Spinoza, on sad affects in general. So the question is an old Marxist question. If things are that bad ecologically, why did the ecological class not yet come into existence and transform the world? It is, for them, for Latour and Schulz, not clear, as they state, against Heidegger's extrapolation of Hölderlin, that where there is danger, there also grows the saving power. It can simply go wrong. Under conditions in which there is no time, and the time there is operates against those who want to maintain and defend the conditions of inhabitability, the inexistent ecological class has to take seriously that we all, I quote, switched cosmology, unquote, since the pandemic forced us to see that the entire civilization had to change their lives under the pressure of something we cohabit with, the virus. We are part, as Latour and Schulz claim, of the same terraforming process. We thus have changed cosmologies because we now act and live together with other living entities that determine us. We have been forcefully demodernized. And therefore, we should learn how to not fall back into the traps of modernization, ideas of progress, ideas of productivism and production. This is again something that we have to learn and can learn from the existent knowledge of indigenous people who always resisted modernization, as Latour and Schulz claim. But under these new cosmological and demodernized conditions, what hinders the ecological class from coming into existence and learning from those who the moderns previously considers savages? They argue that what the ecological class lacks is the appropriate culture. One needs an ecological aesthetic, as Holloway suggested, an ecological religion in liaison, as Latour and Schulz claim, with Christianity, even ecological education in the universities, i.e. Something that strengthens a new form of humanities, an ecological foundational research project, and politically all this has to become ecologically hegemonic. But all this seems too nice to be true, because if we would be able to provide all these conditions, the problem would already have been solved somehow, right? I mean, if we already had universities that would have these new programs, if we already had a new ecological aesthetics, religion, and political agenda, well, then the problem would not be a problem. Which is why ultimately Latour and Schulz let the cat out of the bag. What is needed today is the ecological class. What the ecological class has to do is what the old emancipatory class also had to do, namely to take power. To take power to change the entire organization of power. But how to do this on a planetary level, as taking power just in one state is obviously still too limited in its scope. Surprisingly here, Europe, a conglomerate of states, or the EU, the conglomerate of states that thus far is little more than an economic unit, is called upon and named as a possible supra-statist paradigm of the power that allows to be changed in the right direction if taken over by the ecological class, which makes it even actually more difficult, at least for me, to imagine what this actually means in practice. How does one take over as a class the European Union? Latour and Schulz answer that if we're not simply collecting complaints that are addressed to parties, but if we're on the lookout for, I quote, intensive descriptions of the experienced situation, unquote, the emergence of the projected and called upon class might happen very, very fast as, I quote again, shellfish, alga, corals, and fish return to multiply, unquote, when a block of cement is planted in water. We can now only conjecture its emergence, but it can happen, and it has to happen in the future, the not so distant future. We just have to, I quote again, study, to cultivate, to intensify, to popularize the effects that are necessary to start to fight without falling for the military ethos, unquote. But to let my cat out of the bag here, as with any form of messianism, this ecological class messiah may not only come as a thief in the night, but also simply too late or never. Even though we can learn how to act collectively in the right way, since the indigenous people know, we just never learn to listen to them. We're still not listening, and could only if we practically become the messiah that we're already supposed to latently all be. Last part, I'm almost done. Ending with Badiou and Marx. Alain Badiou has pointed out in 2009, and here echoing a claim by Slavoj Žižek from 2007, that ecology is the new opium for the masses. What does this formula amount to? It is obviously a modification of Marx's old claim that religion is the opium of the people. For Marx, this is also why the criticism of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism. One could reformulate the criticism of ecology is the prerequisite, maybe today, of all criticism. First, one needs to suspend its effects before starting the real business of critique for Marx, because comprehending the nature of religion leads to insights into why it acts as an opiate in the first place. If my traversal of the different fantasies related to our contemporary relation to nature and what follows from it has a point, it is also the precondition, I think, for starting the real business of critique again. For Marx, religion is a contradictory product of the contradictions of capitalism. On the one hand side, it functions like an opium, generating a delusion about the real state of things. Even if the real world is contradictory, high on religion, we still feel good about it. On the other hand side, religion nevertheless bears the mark of this real world. Since without it, there simply would be no religion. Religion exists, as Marx diagnosed, because there is no true realization of equality, freedom, and justice. Human beings create a fictional realization lacking a real one. But religion functions like an opiate because it forecloses the very insight from which it originated. It exists due to contradictions, yet its existence obfuscates its own origin. Human beings create religion to deal with real contradiction, but it's only the fiction of resolving them without actually resolving them. This fictitious nature explains why Marx called religion an inverted consciousness, which nonetheless entails a general theory of the world in its terms. It contains a theory of the world in which there is religion because there is religion. A world without religion would imply a different manner of treating contradictions. Religion comprises a general theory of a contradictory world in which these very contradictions create a need to obfuscate them. Thus, for Marx, the believer knows that there are contradictions in the world, otherwise there would be no fictitious realm of religion, but he nonetheless does not know what he knows. Religion is inverted consciousness or unconsciousness. The believer believes in a fiction that he does not know to be a fiction, and this is why he believes in it. It is this fiction that resolving contradiction of the world without resolving them in the world is still a way of resolving them, which enables him not to believe in what he knows, but to repress it. Right? That is the ultimate belief, the trick of religion. We don't believe in what we know. Religion is a way of believing in a fiction without truly believing what one knows. It is a manifestation of a drive not to know, a drive not to know. This is why, for Marx, we first need to believe what we know. I think at that point, and I'm about to end now, it would be very interesting to look at what how Marx discusses, the early Marx discusses problems of the form, how religion is linked to blockages of emancipation. And this is what he discusses in his text on the Jewish question, where he critiques Bruno Bauer and his account of the antagonism of the Jewish and the Christian religion. The main problem, that's the last point I want to briefly make. The problem of religion is the problem of emancipation in some sense. And the problem of emancipation is the problem of emancipating oneself from a belief system that restricts even the ways in which we think about emancipation, right? So that is so, right? Because religion, again, allows us to project emancipation into another world. So the implication for that Marx brings out in the Jewish question is that we need to emancipate ourselves from the very forms of emancipation that we rely on, and religion is a form of emancipation, we might say, fake emancipation, that does not allow for attaining what it persistently promises, and that keeps therefore disorienting us. Now, in the case of Marx's critique of Bauer, it is the Christian models of emancipation, the Paulinian ones, and the Jewish models of being subjected to things that somehow constrain our ideas of emancipation. So the question is how to overcome the religious matrix overall. And this is a question that will bother thinkers like Nietzsche, Heidegger, or Lacan throughout their life. The religious matrix in Marx's sense is one that implies, at least for the Marx that is critically examining Bauer on this point, that the form of emancipation that determines thinking about emancipation is linked to a specific type of relation, notably the one between religion and the state. The main insight here is that Bauer's reliance, that's the critique, we can go into that, on a form of emancipation that does not question and thus does not emancipate itself from the form of emancipation, leads into fake emancipation. So if someone tells you what the form of emancipation is and hands you over the form of emancipation, that is what the state does in Bauer's account, then emancipation is predetermined and hence not emancipating itself from what is pre-given. Marx therefore claims that because Bauer does not raise the question of emancipation to this level, he becomes entangled in contradiction. In contradictions, he puts forward conditions which are not based on the nature of political emancipation itself. So emancipation does not only seem to need to be an emancipation from religion, from religious form, but it also needs to emancipate itself from anything in emancipation that is unemancipated or resists emancipation that is formally determining it. So what I'm trying to say here is that what is crucial is to emancipate the idea of emancipation even from its pre-given form. It seems to me in the discussion of the relationship to how we can emancipate ourselves from the problematic relations we have to nature or the earth and the planet that I tried to develop earlier, it might be high time to think about rewriting Marx's on the Jewish question and calling it on the ecological question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. That was absolutely that was brilliant. Very challenging. I have the you know, I would say envious task of being able to respond to that talk. Initially, before I open it up to both our Zoom and our YouTube audiences. But before doing that, we'll have a 5-minute break, is what I'm thinking. And we can reflect on a lot. There's a lot of argumentation there. It's just very fresh. So it's 7:08 p.m. in the Gulf, and it's 8:38 p.m. in India. To be a bit non-Orientalist, like I'll let everyone else who's here like sort of work out the time the sort of time zones, but in 5 minutes. So at 8:44 in India, at 7:14 in the Gulf, we will come back, and I'll open up with, you've given me a very challenging task, but a very pleasurably challenging task. So thank you very much. Okay, so we'll see you in 5 minutes, everyone. Hi, am I audible? It's been, I think 5 minutes, I hope. Yes, okay, great. And for our YouTube audience, please put questions. I will Frank, for you, I will field the questions from YouTube. I will read them out loud. So please, our YouTube audience, pose questions. And our Zoom audience, we'll just ask you to raise your hand, and I'll keep the queue, and you come on and hopefully on video, and ask your question directly to Frank. That was an exceptional talk. As you know, I think that we'll probably have many conversations about this in the days to come. But just to sort of try and get at a sort of sort of opening up, sort of meta, right? Sort of question slash or comment slash question with regards to the talk. I mean, what I really saw through listening to you, or what I really heard through listening to you, sorry to mix metaphors, but what I really heard through listening to you, and this wonderful talk was, there seems to be something amiss with regards to something like the minus and the plus, right? So we can say like there's something negative, right? And so like this is the first part of the talk. I think that you really highlighted this, right? It was that there's action now in our contemporary with regards to ecological disaster, any disaster or any sort of problem, right? To put it that way, is considered to be so you have this sort of minus to the plus, which is that any sort of catastrophe, right, is framed and is responded to as we cannot act, right? We cannot act because the solution, the plus to the minus, like, okay, the earth is melting, or like the earth is dying, there's pollution in Delhi today, et cetera, like, the way to solve what seems to be the actionable plus is to stop acting. So acting is inaction, right? It's sort of if I'm getting the argument, and that's I see this, right? Like, this is devastation, right? I mean, like, political devastation, right? We have the idea of like, what is an ethical today, like, contemporary, like an ethical or political act is inaction. I'm sorry, I'm the YouTube. Sorry, Frank, I've just muted that. But so the notion that action is actually inaction, knowledge is actually ignorance. So it's precisely like that something like every minus, every degradation, right, that we have today comes to the perpetuation of that degradation precisely in the form of positivizing that degradation. Like, continue to be ignorant. It's not the time to know the truth, right? Or it's not the time to act. But not the time to act is itself, the responsible liberal approach to acting today is just making people not rush to action, rush to know, right? Rush to think, right? I mean, it was remarkable what you were saying about the fact that thinking is considered to be a potentially catastrophic. Thinking itself is potentially going to lead to a potentially catastrophic outcome, right? That what we need is some sort of autonomous autonomous form of activity that or mind, like thinking, that prevents us from thinking, from acting. So it's thinking without thinking. It's acting without acting to not act. Right? And this is really dire. I think you've put your finger on the problem with the contemporary, and nature, then, sort of ecology is precisely this, as you said. It's sort of, we could even call it like an affect. I know affect theory is quite popular. You don't work with it so much, but like a notion of anticipated regret, right? Let's regret something that might happen in the future. So, right, let's mourn, or let's anticipate the fact that we're going to regret something, the outcome of invading Iraq, of fracking, of whatever. If we say sorry now while we're doing this, right? Well, if we regret now while we're doing what we think will result in regrettable outcomes, right? That's the only form of thinking, of action, of ethics that sort of exist in our contemporary, in a certain sense, right? Like to anticipate, to push your argument further, maybe like to anticipate being apologetic, right? What does that mean? What does that, I mean, what does that look like aesthetically, ethically, politically, right? To actually say sorry before the consequences of a sorrowful act, right, even manifest. And so my sort of meta question, which is going to be the impossible question, right, is what do you think we can do to reconfigure the coordinates of this extraordinarily disjointed contemporary ethics, aesthetics, politics that we live within, right? Like you I think you laid out a critical analysis. I mean, I can't even go into the nuances of everything you've put. We will do that together later, but like that you put forth. But what does it mean, right, to think about exiting this or reconfiguring this, right? Like, because this is not normal, right? It's not normal to say sorry before you've done anything wrong, or before the consequences of a wrong action, right, have manifested, right? And that's what we're doing, right, is what I heard you say in a certain sense, right? We anticipate regret, right? Where we fetishize, in a certain sense, the minus, right? And the imagined effects of the minus by ignoring the real effects of the minus, right? Environmental degradation. Like this is what's happening. But how we plan, how we act is to not act, right? Is what you're saying. Is to say that if you act, then you're going to contribute further to the problem. Right? This is, I think, you said this phrase in the talk, topsy-turvy. This is insane to me. So do you have like an understanding of like how we might be able to develop a politics? I mean, it's a very impossible ask. Like a politics, an aesthetics, like an art, right? An ethics, right? A notion of action, right? That is not reproducing inaction in the very action, that you might be able to suggest to our audiences right here is the first thing I was going to ask. And I have one more thing and then I'll open up. So.
Well, I mean, that is indeed a tricky question, but you're right. I mean, I was trying to say what what does it mean from a political point of view, right? I mean, that is sort of, so I approach the idea that nature can function as a screen itself for something else, right? It's screening off, it's warding off, it's drawing our attention somewhere else. And I'm not saying ecological problems are not real problems, right? Just don't get me wrong, right? I'm not right. That was not, but when it functions as a screen, and I take this to be the point about ecology as new opiates, then one seems to be busy inventing new forms of political inaction, right? Busy inventing new forms of inaction. And that is formally similar to the way in which, since its conception, capitalism has dealt with all problems. Capitalism has never solved a problem, never, in its entire history. It moves them around, it shuffles them around, it hides them here and does something else there, right? It re-invents the problem. It never solves problems. It's simply not that it overcomes contradictions, and that is the form. Right? The form of how capitalism operates, that infects, I think, certain reflections on what it means to deal with effects of environmental devastation and so forth. What does that mean? I think, and this is why I said, I think one has to rewrite Marx's On the Jewish Question. Why? Because, I mean, to boil that down fundamentally, the moment we believe that emancipation in any form can rely on a form that is God-given, on a form that we perceive or just accept as given prior to the act of emancipation, emancipation will never be emancipation, right? That is Marx's critique. And the problem is, that is what makes it religion, right? Religious. We believe certain forms are just given. They're just given. And now it seems to me that the very idea that we're doomed to be in a position of fundamental ontological, almost we could say, inaction, right? That is rehearsed in different ways in the positions that I was discussing, right? That we simply cannot do anything about it, and that is a result of our relation to nature or our position on the planet, can very easily endorse the very idea that the only thing we can do is to maneuver us into a new form of collective inaction, right? However that is supposed to operate in each concrete case. My actual answer to your question would be to be very, very attentive to any form of substitution of actual political action with something else. Right? Because the moment one replaces, that was my second example, what I think was happening somehow in Stenger's. It's a replacement of politics with ethics, right? With an ethics of the other, which is, I think it is problematic. It is problematic because there is an ethics, one could say there is an ethics implied in political collective action, but replacing a political framework with an ethical framework, I think is using nature and whatever we take nature to be again as a screen for that blinds us to political to actual political problems and to political forms of action. The same, I think, happens if we, I mean, right, there's this old complaint that administration in the state replaced politics, right? Or the government is not doing real political work anymore. It's just administering stuff, right? So that is one substitution that has been criticized endlessly. But I think these substitutions, and this is why I wanted to end with De-natura, because they explicitly say ecology must become the primary instance of what we perceive as politics, right? So they are basically saying, let's forget old style politics. Let's start from ecology and then conceive of what it means to make ecology political. But I think it should be exactly the other way around. I mean, I think their proposal is they mean well, but there is something really, really bothersome in the way in which they're articulating it. Re-articulating an entire political language, substituting each and every term with a different interpretation from the main substitution of politics by ecology. This is why I wanted to end with this before moving into Marx, because I think there is something. These replacements are highly problematic for any understanding of politics, and so my plea was, let's not take something that is not political action for what it is not, namely political action. And secondly, we have to think, if we actually want to have an answer to any environmental question, a political collective answer. So, right, and making this distinction, let's not take the substitute for what it's not. And let's approach what I think is a political problem from the primacy of politics and not from what the problem seems to demand. That would be my second clarification. I think these are two axioms of how to even approach an answer to your question.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's great. I mean, again, this sort of like leads into like that's great. I mean, like I totally agree, and like, but that leads into my second question, which is or it's not really a question, Frank. It's like a sort of comment, but like in a certain sense, I'm not differentiating ethics from politics, right? I don't think they're very differentiable, right? I think what the tragedy of, for instance, like the history of mankind with, it used to be human bodies, it's now becoming less human bodies, now it's the Anthropocene, is that ethics get separated from politics. Like, I don't see a distinction between ethics and politics, right? So I like what I know that there was a move, right, to that's when ethics became distinct from politics, was when it was said that, like, okay, politics is not working, partisanship is not working, let's be ethical. But I'm not coming from that perspective in sort of making this comment or this question, right, or asking you this question, right? But what I think okay, let me try and frame this. My second question, right? It's on the issue of emancipation, right? Which I thought was very, very powerful, right? I mean, I think this is also Marx's point, right? In on the Jewish question, right? Which is that there's like I think one of the most brilliant, when I teach that essay, like one of the most brilliant, sort of insights that he adduces is that there's no, we cannot, like, it's trying to collapse the distinction between ethics and politics that is coming to be in the formulations of civil society, state, family, right? I mean, I think we could read that or reread that as a complete annihilation of the distinction between ethics and politics. Like, you can't have ethics without politics, you can't have politics without ethics, right? Like, ethics are partisan they're not historicist, right? I mean, like, it's like partisanship is about partisanship towards truth, towards sort of universal, right? Now, with regards to nature, right, and this is the final question that I'll open up. I see that there's a question already from Retika. With regards to nature, right? It's almost like the ethical blind spot, right? Which it kept coming to me when I was listening to your wonderful paper, you know, like is it the blind, is that we don't understand nature, or we want nature, we desire nature, and that's precisely the problem. We want nature to be with us, right? We want our own nature to be with us. We want to be in sync constantly, right? We want to know how to make love. We want to know how to eat properly. We want to know how to, you know, etc. And hence this absolute fascination with nature, right? Because it seems like animals can do that. They eat as much as they want to eat. Not pets, but animals. They reproduce, you know, cyclically, right? Etc. Etc. Right? So like, it seems like it's this desire, this like our relationship to nature is this desire to want nature to acknowledge that we are also nature, in a certain sense, that we are also in sync when we're not, when we're clearly not, right? We are clearly out of joint. Like, we don't know how to eat properly. We are gluttonous. We kill animals. We destroy the environment. We sometimes don't. We pacify them. We have clubs where we protect animals, or plants. Nowadays, you know, plants as well. But what I think the ethical position that ethical political position that we should take, maybe that like really came out of your talk, you know, for me. Again, I'm abstracting from the very, very strong nuance of your argument, is that we're incapable of understanding nature's indifference, our own nature's indifference to ourselves, to our thought, right? And so what would it mean for the fact that we happen to be speaking beings, right? We have speech. What would it mean to develop an ethics or a politics, communism, you know, like a environmental, like sort of protectionism, or whatever you want to call it, whereby it's the fact that we recognize that our bodies, in a certain sense, our nature and nature are indifferent to the way that we think, so that we bear a tremendous responsibility for our thought. So this means that the ethics or the politics would be around the fact that we, right, the fact that we speak, the fact that we haven't figured it out as human beings, right, how to reproduce, or how to reproduce seamlessly, how to eat proportionally, sustainably, etc., right? But nature seems to be able to do this on its own, we fantasize, right? What would it mean for us to take seriously the fact that politically, ethically, and I'm not dividing these two things, politically, ethically, what would it mean to take seriously, right, the fact that when we think, right, it's a thinking. When us humans speak or think, it's a thinking or speaking that should not ask for nature to be a model, or animals to be a model for how we should behave, but how we might be able to create with nature, with animals, right? And not be so anxious such that we become gluttonous, such that we want to go on trophy hunting safaris, right? Etc. That actually, like, animals are really indifferent to us as a species. Plants are indifferent to us, and we are indifferent to each other as well as to plants and animals. And what type of creation can you come up with from an ethics of indifference, an ethics / politics of indifference, right? As opposed to hyper attention. Let's surveil plants. Let's surveil animals. Let's surveil humans' bodies, right? What would it mean to? Can we develop, like, if nature, so-called nature, what we've projected as something external to us, can teach us anything? It might just be that that nature is indifferent, right? Like it resists our projections. So is there any ethics or politics that we can come up with around the idea of something like indifference, right? As opposed to a hyper attention to how we might be able to commune, how we might be able to think about communing. What would thought look like? What would politics look like? What would ethics look like? When the groundwork is something like an indifference, right? Like,
yeah.
That's it. And then I'll open it up.
No, thank you. So why I was making the distinction between ethics and politics is, I mean, somehow reliance on two arguments, one by that I didn't refer to, one made some time ago by Slavoj Žižek in his discussion of Levinasian ethics, which he calls the political suspension of the ethical, because he thinks that the moment we address political problems as problems of the other only, and that was what I was trying to argue for, that Stengers takes nature as an other, right? And the relation to that other has primacy over any other relation. And the interesting thing about that is the Levinasian other, that is already Žižek's argument, is it demands something from us, right? That is Levinas's ethically, a certain reaction. But because the demand is so indeterminately formulated, we will never appropriately be able to fulfill it. And hence, that is Žižek's argument, the other in Levinas is super egoic, right? Right? The more we try to comply with it, the more it keeps demanding. That's the structure, right? And so what I was trying to understand is, why are we putting ourselves in such a place where we think of nature as another that somehow, and this is now Stengers, I think, interesting variation, where nature does not demand from us something, but at least we can offend it. Right? I would say that is the last grain of human exceptionalism. At least we can piss off nature. And that is amazing, right? I mean, because who can? Nature should not give a fuck. And it's far more troublesome that nature is fundamentally different. That is the difference that I would also draw. I mean, I only said to me, it seems like a trivialized substitution for what the early Luther described as God, because Luther's God is indifferent to human species, even though it is his creation. I mean, as Luther famously once said, the human being is a piece of shit that has fallen out of God's anus. And if we understand that, this is the perspective. So it has an excremental status, right? That is the perspective that God has on humans, right? And I mean, if you remember your last time in the bathroom, I mean, how much did you care, right? I mean, that is the degree of indifference. That is, I think, the problem with the primacy of the ethical framework. I think there is an ethics inscribed into politics. I'm absolutely certain and absolutely convinced by that. But that ethics means, I think, to not take nature, to not relate to nature in three ways, in the three ways that I try to problematize. I mean, not aestheticize nature and take nature as something that issues clear demands. That is what I described as Catholicism or aesthetic Catholicism, nor to ethicize it as the ultimate other that demands in an enigmatic way, nor to think it is inherently already political. I think that is a catastrophic category mistake. What does that mean? For me, it means to absolutely take seriously that nature is fundamentally indifferent to us. We emerged as an element in nature that for nature is just as another thing in nature, but for us, everything changed. So we have two perspectives that absolutely are incongruous and that are weirdly embodied in one being, namely the human being, right? We are natural because we emerge out of nature, but we are the only ones who think we're exceptional. And for nature, there is no difference. I mean, right, personifying it, for we're not making a difference, but for us, we are making a difference, a fundamental difference. What that means, I think, politically, is that one has to have an organization, a political form of organization, to which absolutely belongs the way in which we organize our production and reproduction vis-a-vis nature and our relation to nature, absolutely. And we're doing a catastrophic job on that front. But ethicizing, aestheticizing, or politicizing nature, like inscribing politicality, ethicality, or clear representations into nature, I think is a very problematic way of dealing with it. Rather, the political and hence organizational question is, what is an organizational collective framework that allows, on the one hand side, to absolutely insist on nature's absolute indifference to us, right? That on the other hand side, and that is a reproductive question for us. This is why I basically said, I mean, there will still be a planet, right? We can kill ourselves and all species, but right, it just goes on, right? I mean, and maybe even better. I mean, the people who basically proclaim the extinctionalists, right? I mean, that nature is far better off without the human species, right? That argument, they emphasize that. I mean, we should kill ourselves off, and that is the pure ethical kind of thing to do. So my answer is, the real question is, what is the form of political collective organization that takes seriously that nature is indifferent, and nevertheless we depend on it as one of the two. I mean, I remain a Marxist in that one of the two essential components that any form of value genesis will always rely on, right? Labor and nature. These are the two components from which everything springs in some form. And so the question of how to organize that is the crucial question. What I was trying to say is, it is very easy to miss that question and to answer a question which will just further contribute to additional disorientation.
No, we'll carry on with that. It's great. I mean, I'm in agreement with your argument, and I shouldn't say argument, but arguments that you laid out. Let's go to Ritika Biswas, one of our CDEP curators, for a question, Frank.
Hello, Frank. I am still metabolizing all of that. So this is just going to be kind of picking up on a couple of things that I think emerged most strongly for me, both from your talk as well as from your answers. Kind of coming back to this idea of the non-offensive ethics, right? And I remember you sort of speaking about, I guess about the ways in which we did not learn from indigenous practices, right? And the ways in which their sort of both phenomenological as well as ontological relationship worked with nature. I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that a bit more, because I mean, maybe I missed something because my internet is a little bit sketchy, but who are we referring to, and what practices and strategies exactly is being referred to here? Because I agree with you, and this is something I'm trying to contend with as well, is just as we're trying to not sublimate or aestheticize or sort of inherently politicize nature, I also don't kind of want to do that with a lot of the indigenous sort of literature and scholarship and practices that I've been studying, right? And so I'm just wondering how to not do that in a way, and how you kind of go about doing that. And I also just have a different question, which is very simple, but almost, it has kind of been plaguing me through your talk, is that it's not about trying to find the solution, right? I mean, of course, we're kind of like going into the emancipatory politics of it, but it's almost like, what is the actual problem? What is the problem that we're seeking a solution to? Like, what is the problem of the Anthropocene? Because very often when we're talking about the Anthropocene, it's just it's a fucking laundry list of effects and affects. It's not the actual crux of what lies at it. So I guess that's also something I wanted to throw out there.
Thanks. That was absolutely great. I mean, I just start with the second one. I think you're absolutely right. I think one should actually have a discussion about that. What is the problem? I mean, really, right? I mean, because some interpret it as another hit to human self-understanding, right? I mean, the next turn, we're not even, but is that actually the problem, that we feel diminished, out of control? It's unclear, right? I mean, would one say first we learn, okay, we're not the center of the universe, then we're not even masters in our own home, right? And there is an unconscious, and now well, even there's no ready-made place in nature, and we can fuck up more than we are able to ever turn back. But the problem, I mean, yes, we are suffering from multiple self-misunderstandings, one could say, right? But is that really the problem? I think, and this is what I implicitly only pointed towards, and this is why I wanted to end it with the whole question of emancipation. I think one should have a different talk about what do we think genuine political agency is, right? Do we solve it if we think we just need to conceive of a multi-species subject, right? What would that mean? Is it appropriate to use, for example, the language of rights? I mean, remember, I think I mentioned that once, the late Michel Serres, when he was talking about the Gulf of Mexico and the oil spill of the Shell company, basically said, well, the entire history of the Western rights system is the inclusion of further and further new subjects into, right, this system. First, I don't know, indigenous people, then women. I think that is how it went, right? And now we need to include natural objects. But there is something very strange in articulating it like that, I think. And so I think if one thinks that our relationship to nature is problematic, which it is, then maybe this is a symptom of another problem. Right, and this is why I insisted so much that maybe the primacy, or not maybe, the primacy of politics over other approaches to that kind of problem seems to me fundamental. But contradictions that determine our organization of society also over-determine our relationship to nature, absolutely. I think, and they're absolutely important, but maybe just solving them. I mean, think of any Green Party in power, right? I mean, it's always absolutely, that is the only bits which I really disliked in the Latour Schulz book, because they basically say, well, it's all this urgency and all our things. Let's look at the most recent elections in France. The Green Party only got 5%, and they're basically irrelevant. How is that possible? It sounds as if they think if they got 30%, this would actually change anything, right? I mean, but that relies on beliefs that are insane, right? I mean, the governmental politics can easily just like change this, that this is what, right? All these things. So I think one should actually start the discussion precisely with your question, what is the problem? My answer was that there is a disorientation that is so profound that we don't even know what problem is solved through the proposals. And that is the problem we may have to tackle before we get to the actual problem. This is why I wanted to end with this Marxian slogan to say that the critique of ecology must maybe precede any other critique, must be the prerequisite for any other political critique, because otherwise we're just, I mean, we're just stuck in weird substitutions of actually getting to any problem. And I think this is I'm absolutely in full endorsement of your first question as well, because both texts, I mean, they're very small books, right? I mean, and both texts in which the indigenous play a role, and I think someone like Catherine Yusuf has something more interesting maybe to say about these kinds of things. They're just mentioning indigenous people, right? Without specification. They're just basically saying there are people who resisted modernization, and hence we can learn from them. It's totally unclear what all this means. Does that mean look at practices? I mean, they haven't, I mean, and especially if one raises the problem on a planetary scale, that is, I mean, how does that translation then work from a very local group of practices, right, to a planetary response? And they're absolutely clear that this is what has to happen. And they think, so Latour and Schulz think that we have been, this is why I reconstructed them in this way, we have been demodernized through the virus, right? We started believing in something we can't see, and it starts determining us, and we cohabit, and we have to be careful, and blah, 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 all these things. But is that what the modernists would describe as a savage or in more neutral, is that an indigenous practice automatically? I mean, I find these categorical and conceptual things, one would have to say a lot more about this, especially because one should not forget that the whole dream of an alter modernity or a demodernization can be politically highly problematic. Just to give you one really, and simply out of sort of my own prehistory example, German Nazism is an alter modern project, right? It basically says modernity is Jewish, so let's create an alter modernity that avoids the Jewish plot, right? And so not all alter modernity options are necessarily good ones. So one has to say a lot about, and this is why I think your question is absolutely pertinent. I don't have an answer because the answer is not in the books. One has to say a lot on who is one talking about. Is one, how does knowledge extraction or knowledge transmission work in their language into another language? How does the translation work? Is it about practices? Is it about organization? How does one extend and expand these things? I didn't find any answer to that, to that very important question anywhere there. But I think it's absolutely pertinent to avoid, I mean, really catastrophic assumptions.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts, but I would just say Zoe Todd is someone who writes a lot about the Anthropocene discourse and sort of incorporating, I guess, indigenous knowledges in a way that is not just about the sort of almost like this anthropological or ethnographic sort of practice, which very often happens even, say, within Haraway's work, for example, you know, to take like a very famous example, and sort of metaphorizing everything, but to actually take it as political praxis and as lexicons, you know, in ways that are crucial. But thank you so much, Frank. That was very, very, generative.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ritika. Thanks, Frank, for your response, Ritika. That was, yes, very generative. Other questions from our, or I know we're running right up against the end, and I know you're sniffling, Frank, but Rico, please come.
Hi there. Thanks, Frank. That was fantastic. So I've got just a few quick comments. I'll start with a very brief comment, which is just to register my irritation at the, I think it was Holloway, first of the text that you mentioned, where, you know, he goes through this whole problematic and the solution is whatever it is. And then he says at the end, and we'll get art to do that job for us, right? Art will, whatever it is we need politically, we call on aesthetics to do that for us. And that just seems, you know, that's just a complete miscomprehension of how art ever works. And it's, you know, that's doomed to failure, I think. So that's just my first little irritation. But something more substantive. I really appreciated your discussion of the yips and Chuck Knobloch. And I was around. I followed that story from a baseball fan's perspective, right? And these strange things that happen right in the yips, and that was brilliant the way you used that. But I'm just wondering, that question of yips related to affordances, right? And then I was wondering, is there a relationship between affordances and the question of emancipation that you were talking about at the end? So is emancipation, you know, the wrong form of emancipation? Is that something like how an affordance appears?
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, so Holloway, I might be simplifying him, but I think I'm not really. He thinks it is creating a new kind of idea of the earth as political forum. And how do we do that? By making visible what otherwise is invisible. And that is what art can do, right? I mean, that is the contribution. Yeah. So that we have a theoretical insight, a political project, and artistic means, right? I mean, so, it is unclear if, it sounds as if it works as a theoretically informed and politically oriented microscope or something like that, right? I mean, and that is clearly quite limited. The affordance point that I was trying to make is why I at one point only briefly mentioned that maybe the ontology of affordance is problematic, and one has to think about it. So let me put it differently. Maybe the affordance is, and that is interesting in the Knobloch and other examples, because when a certain performance skill is reached, the affordance does seem to lose its objectivity. But it's highly subjective if you move like this, and the timing and everything. So in this sense, the affordance does not pre-exist its interpretation as affordance, right? And if that is the case, there is a certain type of reification going on in the three descriptions of the problem that I try to basically say are problematic, because they all three think affordances are in some sense objective, right? But maybe one must think of the affordance, the constitution of affordance, linked to a process of political subjectivization or interpretation. I mean, that was the idea. And maybe that is an answer of what that means politically. Maybe if we is having a project, I mean, let me put it differently, right? I mean, and whatever name we want to put on it, then this kind of name or project that we're engaged in is the exact affordance which will allow the political organization to come into being through engaging with that affordance. That would be I think the direction. And I think a too objectivist interpretation is problematic. So someone like Dreyfus distinguishes between affordances and solicitations. And solicitations are not even objective, but they're more automatic. And I didn't want to complicate that discussion too much, but he accounts for that. So when I'm solicited, I could not even step back. But if solicitation becomes affordance, then I'm already sort of degrading my performance skill, and then it can get worse. Yeah, I hope that is an answer.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rico. Thanks, Frank, for that. And we're hitting 9:30 because I think we're very, very packed with arguments. The wonderful finale, Frank. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. Thank you to everyone on YouTube as well. So this is a great colloquium. I mean, I think one of the most important parts of what we were trying to do with this colloquium was think about the Anthropocene a bit more critically, right? We're all concerned about the environment. We're all concerned about sort of what's going on in our contemporary, which is not tremendously pleasant. So we all share, communally, like the fact that there's a problem, but how to approach that problem is what we try to do a bit differently. And Frank, I think you concluded brilliantly, and I'm going to listen to your talk several times, and we'll be in touch. Of course, throughout the week and going forward. So thank you all. Mace is here. So Mace, do you want to say something?
Thank you so much. No, honestly, it's been a pleasure hearing from everyone, both presenters and discussants. It's been such a privilege to have you guys on these calls. It's an invaluable resource. We already see how many people have been going back to all our conversations before. So really, thank you so much for your generosity and sharing your questions, your discussions, kind of putting all of that out on the table in public. So we really appreciate it, and hope that everyone is, not a stranger in the future. We hope to see you all. Right.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you all.
Oh,
Good night.
nice.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.